So looking at these ears, we've got a combination of warm greys, dark browns and black, and some gingery, orangey colours in there as well. And there's quite a lot of different fur texture. So I'm just going to blow up my reference photo on my iPad so I can really see the detail in the ears. So what I'm going to do first is plot in some of the shapes of the darker areas. So we've got sort of darker areas around here and around here. I am going to use one of the Pablos, I think. I'm going to use a combination of the Bista, which is like a bit like the dark sepia, actually, a little bit lighter than the dark sepia in the polychromos, and the charcoal and cocoa. So I'm going to use the Bista, and I'm just going to come in here and just start. It's quite sharp, but I'm not going to resharpen it once I get going. I'm going to use really, really light pressure. And the things with the Pablos is that they are lovely and soft. They're not creamy, they're more like velvet when they go down. And what I'm going to do is just plot in some of these colours, taking into account the texture that I'm getting from the fur. So it's quite open weaved, and I'm just plotting the colours in relatively roughly, but just, you know, keeping an eye out for the direction of the fur, and obviously the shape of these colours. He's different to the other donkey in that he's sort of more, there's lots more white on him. And it comes round into the edgy bits as well. So the blunter my pencil gets, the more soft the texture I'm able to get when I put the pencil on the paper. And we can refine these areas, lifting out and shaping it, and, you know, adding to it and what have you. I find just sort of blocking in these areas of colours first, that I can then work around them. So this bit here that I'm putting in here is actually the middle of the donkey's ear. Well, it's you can see the side of the donkey's ear. This is the darkest area where it kind of goes in, and then you've got all of this fluff around it. So I'm just using this really open texture when I'm laying my pencil in. And don't worry if it's looking a bit gritty or anything like that. You know, we're going to put a lot more layers over the top of this. And this gets me really frustrated, how I can't lift the graphite up. Because this is a bright white piece of fur, a bright white bit of highlight, and I don't want a big blooming line there, and that's why I don't like the transfer paper at all. What I might have to do is actually scrape it out in the end. Right. So I'm going to use the cocoa now, just because this is much more grey. following your reference photo. So I'm literally looking at my reference photo, looking at my drawing, back up to my reference photo, back up to my drawing. All the time I'm constantly referring to my reference photo. So the other thing to do as well is to become quite familiar with the structure that you're drawing. So if it's not, I just need to be careful of that eye as well. If it's not apparent as to how the ear structure is working, so if you can't work out where the inside bit is, where there's a curl, or how which bits are more in shadow than others, just the structure of the ear, it's a good idea just to have a really good look at it, because sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees, especially if it's not a fantastic photograph, and you kind of think you're drawing something and then after you've been drawing it for a while, you're like, oh, that's what I'm drawing, that's what it should be like. So actually down here there's a big curl around this outer edge of the ear, but it's not that apparent on the photograph. And I can be as rude as I like about this photograph because it is mine, and I don't pretend to be a photographer. I've got a good camera and I take good, goodish photographs, but sometimes areas that you really do need more definition in don't have it. So the other thing that we can do as well, once we've got the structure of the ear in place and the blocks of tones in place, is we can put over the top glazes of colour. So there's sort of like some really nice yellow ochre colours coming in here, but I can put those in a little bit later. And when you're putting your initial layer in, just picking out some of the shapes that the hair is making. There's all sorts of different fur types in here. We've got quite coarse, short, I call it stubbly fur. Well, it's not curly, particularly on his forehead, and then you get to areas where it is more wavy. But then on his ears, you've got some real proper little curls going on in here, which I think is important to capture. So they will take a little bit of concentration to get right. But if you get a semblance of the texture in first, so we're not drawing detail, we're just drawing a semblance of the fur in there that we can then go in and start to add shadows to. And obviously it's really quite light at the moment, so the pressure that you're using on the paper is really quite light, so it nowhere represents at the moment the correct tonal qualities, but you're starting to get in some of that nice texture right from the start. And it might not be, well, it isn't exactly the same as what's on the photograph, but it's a representation of if you want to follow the photograph exactly, then that's entirely up to you. Right, okay. So I'm just going to build in now some of this orangey fur in here. And again, just really, really light pressure this is quite a sharp pencil, so if I went in with too heavy a pressure, I could actually carve into the paper again. Just need to be careful that you cover up the bits that you've done in case it smudges. So the hair on the donkey's ears is quite coarse, and actually there's quite a lot of highlight in there, so I'm gonna put the hair in. And I'm using sort of rough sketchy motions and circles, and just to try and get that sort of wiry look of the fur. And then I'm going to kind of dab bits of it out again and there again you can see part of the part of that blooming transfer graphite poking through. Honestly, I don't know why I use it. I need to get myself a new projector. But what we can do is I can maybe scratch some of that out. I mean, it's not an issue really, because you kind of can get rid of it, but it's very annoying. Okay, so I'm just going to go in and just sort of literally just dab little bits out. I may go a little bit darker here just to try and incorporate that stupid line. Okay, so just bringing in some of the burnt sienna combined with that terracotta just to darken up areas, and not going into specific detail, but just adding to those layers the bits of colours that you can see. Very, very lightly. Can add a bit into there as well, actually. Actually, I might bring in some Caput Mortuum Violet into this dark area down here as well, together with the black, just because it's quite a dark area, but it's quite warm. So still using these sort of sketchy, jiggly pencil movements and little circles, just to try and replicate that fur texture. Right, so this is the Caput Mortuum Violet here, which I'm just going to add a bit of darkness and structure to these areas. And we can just keep coming back to these areas and just adding more layers, you know, darkening them up as you build the structure of the ear. And then, you know, as you build the layers up, starting to build in some of that detail. I need this ear to look like it's curved. Right. I'm going to use a little bit of sanguine in here. So sanguine's a really nice sort of pinky orange that's great for using with cooler colours like blacks and blues, because it tends to not turn green, and it just adds a little bit of extra depth. You know, so if you're drawing fuzz, like we're drawing these fuzzy ears now, if you're drawing fuzz, then you know your pencil needs to be drawing fuzz, and the way to do that is to, for me, is to visualize, you know, what the hair looks like, feels like, and then try and replicate that feeling with my pencil. So little tiny sketchy light movements, getting the pencil down on the paper, different directions, is going to give you a fuzzy feel. You know, if you tried to fill this in and just did it sort of quite smoothly, you're not going to get the feeling of that that fluffy fuzziness. Right. Now, what colour are we going to do these ear bits? So they're quite bright white, but obviously bright white's not going to stand out very well. I could go for either a cold grey or, oh no, I'll tell you what, I'll go with a warm grey. Let's go with a warm grey one. I'm not going to sharpen it. And I'm just going to put these tips in, and then what I'll do is I'll make sure that the surrounding areas are dark enough that the warm grey bits look light enough, if that makes sense. That's what we'll do, and then we can blend this nicely out. And there are bits that are bright white and got like a really bright highlight on them, and I can just pull that out with the Scotch Magic Tape. Once we've got the ear in, we can look at pulling highlights out to create sort of like a little bit more brightness. But I think getting the entire ear in first is the way to go. You know, the structure of the ear. So I'm using light pressure again. In the direction of the fur. We can add some definition in once we've got more of this sort of base layers in, and then I'm going to use the same warm grey one for these areas. Now this fur is almost like it's crinkly fur, if that makes sense. So I'm going to let the texture of the paper help me on this. I'm going to allow the texture of paper to show through. So I'm not going to put a huge amount of layers into this, these paler bits here. I'm just going to put a really soft layer in, overlapping to get some of the hair that's coming out at this side, keeping it really nice and soft. And then once we've got all of the blocks of colour in, I can then go back and I can start to just introduce little areas of colour. So I'm going to go over the top of this that I put in before, just to sort of smooth it back a little bit. Okay, so as we come into this area here, there's some shorter hairs that poke out from here. Actually, they're quite a bit darker, but we'll get them in anyway. Got a bit too dark in this area here, so I'm just going to pull out. And it's quite rough where I'm pulling out, but just to so there's no real precise pencil lines at the moment. It is all just, you know, get the texture in, get the colour block down, get a you know, an idea of the form of what it is that you're drawing, and then build up a few layers, and then we can look at building in some of that nice detail. So I'm going to pick up my warm grey 2 and just start to increase the intensity of these tones in here, and butting up to that horrible graphite line to make it look like, well, it does look, there is a dark line where the donkey's ear finishes, and then the highlight hits the rest of the hair. So I'm going to incorporate that graphite line into there, just because I can't rub it out. I don't really want to scratch it out because it's going to leave a visible mark. And we'll just treat it as the edge of the donkey's ear, which actually looks okay. It's so frustrating when you know, you've done an outline and then you can't get rid of that outline when you need to do. It's not so bad on darker coloured animals, but on light coloured ones, or where you've got like a bit of white showing through, it's so frustrating if you can't get a shot of it. And then, so this was all coming down here, so I need some darker colours in here, but I'm just going to put a bit of the direction of the fur in here and how it's looking, and I can darken that up. And then that moves into this area here. And this is where we'll see some really nice fur texture in here that we can start to concentrate on once we've got the rest of the colour blocking in. Okay. So you can see this little ear starting to come to life. And there's a bit of highlight there. You just nip that out. So lovely soft pressure all of the time. We're wanting texture, and we're wanting the fur to look like you can run your fingers through it. That's basically the aim for me, that it looks like fur. And as much as it sounds really well, I think when you look at a reference like this, in fact I'm going to use the dark sepia in here. When you look at a reference photo like these donkeys, and all you see is fur, fluffy fur, I think it can be really quite overwhelming, because you look at it and I think it can be quite overwhelming, because you look at your reference photo and all you can see are these, is fluff, especially when you look at an animal like this with all of, and your first reaction is, there's no way I can do that. There's absolutely no way that I can replicate that. It's just going to be too hard and blah blah blah, and I won't be able to do it. And I think, as everything, if you tell yourself you can't do something, then your brain believes you. And it will it will go out of its way to prove you right. I did a lot of confidence coaching when I was when I used to ride, and when I was managing teams a while ago, and one of the biggest things is to try not to have any negativity in whatever you're doing. Try not to have any negativity at all. Not to the point where you become this massive big head where you claim that you can do anything, but going into something with the attitude that you can do it, and that you will find a way of overcoming any challenges or areas that you find a little bit tricky. That's a much better attitude to come into anything, really. So coming to do a drawing like this, so the donkey on the left, you can see him, you can see a little bit of his ear there, Gary the donkey. I I've drawn a donkey in the past, but she wasn't a very fluffy donkey. She had some fluffy bits on, but nothing like Gary, who's I think he's your typical sort of beach donkey type thing. So I hadn't really done any fur like his before. Even though I've drawn a lot of animals, I've drawn curly dogs and, horses with curly manes, all that type of stuff. I still hadn't drawn fur like this before. So it was important to me to sit down and really think about how I was going to tackle it. How am I going to tackle this curly fur? What is my aim? What do I want my outcome to be? Am I wanting it to be photo perfect? When people look at it, what do I want them to think? And for me, it's all about the animal looks real, and you could actually, sink your hands into his fur. That's the outcome I wanted. So then it was a case of, okay, so how am I going to create this fur? What am I going to do? And that's when I started to think about not the paper, because I always use the same paper, but the pencils I was going to use and what materials I was going to use with them. So was I going to use white paper? Was I going to use dark paper? I decided to go with white paper just because I felt I could get the softer highlights in with, almost like a subtraction method, taking out the highlights once you put the darks in. So the white paper was then, right, okay, so we're using white paper, and then looking at my pencils, which brand am I going to use? And I tend to mix and match anyway, but I will use a specific brand more than others throughout, depending on what it is that I'm wanting to do. So for the other donkey, my thought was, well, I'm wanting really soft, fuzzy texture. So for me, the best pencil to use would be the Caran d'Ache Pablos, because they're very velvety when they go down. They're quite soft, and they've got some good donkey colours, actually. Some good greys that I can put down as a base, and then I can add washes of colour over the top. So that was kind of right. Okay, so I've got my base pencil, I've got my my paper. Where do I start? So I drew his eye first of all, and then I started on the top left, which happens to be his neck. So I had I had sort of like a couple of hours of sort of playing around with things to find out what was working best. And it was just literally a case of laying down layers of colour, lifting out little bits, laying down more, lifting out little bits, creating shapes and filling those with shadows and stuff like that. And that's how it worked out. So it's kind of working out a process in your head as to how you're going to tackle something, and having those thoughts at first really does help. I do like to jump in and just crack on. I don't make colour swatch charts, and I don't sort of get all my pencils out ready with the colours and everything ready. I'll have a few base colours that I'll always use, but as I'm going through my pieces, I'll be like, oh, I can see this colour, oh, I can see that colour. So the colours will just kind of emerge as I'm working through a piece. Okay, so I'm just adding the areas of colour very lightly. I'm not building up the contrasty bits all together. I've added some dark in here just to give a little bit of an idea as to where things are going to be going, and I'm going to build those up as I go along. Really watching the direction of the hair as well, because the hair in this donkey's ear is going all over the blooming place. So this bit here is actually a rolled part of the outside. Part of the outside of the donkey's ear. This bit down here. So just being, quite clever with your pencils when you're laying it down, you can start to replicate some of these hairs that are kind of the stray hairs that are moving across, and of course we can lift them back out with the slice tool. But you can see I'm not creating tiny details. I'm just putting colour in, but I'm putting colour in, in a way that's replicating the hair that's sitting on the donkey's ear. And because we're putting everything in so lightly, we can just lift it out if we need to. So this part of the ear is really quite textured. So I'm putting quite a bit of pigment in, knowing that I'm going to be taking quite a bit of it out. But I can't get the texture and the feel without putting the pigment in first. If I tried to just replicate that with just layers of pencil, it's going to look contrived and just not quite right. Got some gorgeous pinky bits coming in here as well, which should be nice. Okay, so I'm going to move to my warm grey 2 again. and just fill these bits in here. Okay, let's just bring a bit more of that. Okay, so still just blocking in bits of colour, and really quite roughly. Because the little bits of hair texture that you can see in the photo, and sort of like almost you can see separate hairs, that will come once I've built in some more layers. I'm going to do this bit here separately because I just want to work on this area here and then work on this bit, because there are quite a lot of dark areas in here, and there's some really nice fur texture that I want to I'll probably zoom in a little bit closer and take my time on that. Not that I'm not taking my time on the other areas, but because it's quite a small area and there's a lot of detail in there, I just need to add, I just need to take a little bit more care really in what I'm doing. Right, okay, so I'm going to come in now with putty eraser and just lift out some of the areas just to make it a little bit whiter. I'm also using my putty eraser as a bit of a smoothing tool as well, so I'm lifting out colour, but I'm also sort of smoothing what's underneath. So I'm dabbing, but I'm also kind of dragging the colours together. Right. The putty eraser for me is one of the main tools that I use for creating especially sort of fluffy hair and fur. I just find it works so well. I don't use an actual eraser on the pastel mat. I find it I don't find it works very well, and it can take the surface off. I know others use like the electric razors and everything, but I tend not to. And any mistakes that I can't lift with the putty eraser, I'll just incorporate into the drawing. So here you can start to see, you can start to see that I'm starting to build up these sorts of layers of colour, so that you've got hair sitting on the top of other hair sitting on the top of other hair, if you see what I mean. And I do that very, very lightly, putting colour in, taking it away, putting colour in, taking it away. And actually it's not particularly painstaking, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time. And I think it's quite an effective way of creating this kind of fur. Right, I'm going to choose. What am I going to choose? I did take a load of pencils out to use and sharpen them ready, and then I've hardly used any of them because I've decided differently. So this is a warm grey 5. I'm rubbish with my Roman numerals. Warm grey 5, and I'm just going to add in some of these darker areas. And what I'm starting to do now, because even though it doesn't look like I've got an awful lot of layers down, I have got a few layers down, even though I've taken away some of them, if that makes sense. But I'm now going to start to add in just a little bit of detail in that there's some bits of hair coming in, so I'm just going to leave some little areas free of colour, and then I just need to be quite careful of how this hair sits, because actually the hair kind of folds around the ear, so I need to make sure that I am replicating that. And I'm using really light pressure as always. And what tends to happen is you build these areas of colour and you use this open texture, and you'll get little gaps appearing which then form hairs, and you get areas where you've got more pencil has gone over it, and that is some of the darker hairs. Areas where there's no colour gone in, or you've missed out completely, and those are the highlighty bits. And that's how, so I'm not drawing every single hair on purpose. I'm just using my pencil strokes to help me make it look like I've drawn every single hair, if that makes sense. But using this open texture with your pencil just means that you can get all sorts of different colours in there, because when you use different colours over the top of each other, they give you a third colour, if you like. And I'm allowing the texture of the paper to come through. If you can, always get your paper to help you. Don't let your paper work against you. And that's one of the reasons why I choose to do white animals on the white paper, because I can let the paper do the work for me. Okay, so this is a bit darker here. So what I'm doing here is I'm going in the direction of the fur, but I'm leaving bits out and darkening other bits, and the bits that I'm leaving out, I'm then going back over and just sort of filling in some of the little shapes that have been left behind, and those then are starting to create little shadows. And then, as if by magic, you've got an ear that looks like you've spent ages and ages and ages drawing every single tiny little hair, and you really haven't. It's just knowing how to use your pencil to create these little sort of shapes that you can then use to make it look like you've drawn individual hairs. And I'm just thinking how this technique, it's not something that I have learnt from anybody. It's not something that I've seen tutorials of, or YouTube videos of, or anything like that. It's just something that I've kind of figured out on my own, whilst I've been sitting thinking, how do I do this, how do I do that, how do I get my fur to look like that. I suppose when you draw as many portraits as I do, because I work full time, and I do up to 8 portraits a month, you kind of you learn from every single piece that you do. And not necessarily that every single piece you do is better than the previous one, because that's really not the case. Sometimes you might create the most amazing piece, and then the second one, for whatever reason, might just not be quite as amazing, or it might have it might be slightly different style because the photograph wasn't particularly good or anything, something like that. So adding in, taking away again, you're still going to get these lovely shapes because you're not pulling all of that colour out, but you're getting a really nice softness to the fur. And we don't need to worry about really dark areas just yet, because we can put those in once we've got everything down and we've got the form of the ear and the shape and everything. We can then start to really go to town with the detail. Oops. Just need to make sure that we keep this area of, it's like a white stripe in down here. And then, so this bit here is the edge of the ear. Ears can be really, really tricky to do, especially if you don't have a particularly great photo. Well, I like to have some sort of form of definition in the ears, and sometimes the photos are they're overexposed or underexposed or whatever, and they're just there's just a blackness. There's no kind of form to them, especially horses' ears. But fluffy ears are really, really fun to draw. Right, so this up here needs to be darker. And we can just pull a bit of that out actually, because that's quite light down in. There's light catching this and it's quite orangey, so let's just keep that light. This bit here that I'm doing is actually this is the inside of the donkey's ear. If it was facing forwards, you see on this one, it was this bit here, but because it's to the side, you can't see much of it. Right, so we're going to use the warm grey 1 just to kind of pull those. Actually, I might use the cold grey 1 in here as well, just because this is a brighter area of fur, and I think this will probably work a bit better than the warm grey. And I can come over this bit here where we've got different greys in and just blend that over with this warm grey 1. So you're still getting the texture coming through, and you're still getting those areas of light and dark, but just blending it slightly. I don't want to blend it too much. The thing with the white pastel mat is it can go a bit smeary if you're not careful, and you get smears, whereas instead of sort of like defined areas, they just all look a bit muddy and smeared. So that's something you have to be a little bit careful of. And that tends to, for me, I've only had it happen on the white board. So as long as you know it happens, then you can kind of work with it or work around it. So I'm going to use the Scotch Magic tape, and I'm just going to start lifting out little areas. So we literally just take a piece of tape. This is straight off the roll, so it's quite sticky, and just lay it lightly over your surface and draw over the top, either with a pencil or a stylus or something like that. Because I've put a few layers down, it won't lift as much up around the surrounding areas, but it still will lift extra up. So just be, aware of that and be careful. So I'm just starting to build in now the texture of the fur. So we've got colour in there, we've got some form in there. Now we're just starting to build up a little bit of that texture. And we're creating shapes that we can then go back in and either leave or fill. So the texture on the furs is quite fuzzy. So adding a little bit of texture when you pull the tape off, that can be useful. Just however you want to do it, really. And the more that you draw over the top of it, the less sticky it becomes. And the same rules apply for the direction of the fur, because those marks are going to appear on the actual paper. So just make sure you follow the direction of the fur or the hair. And sometimes it can feel like you put all of these layers down, done all this work, and then you kind of undo it when you put when you lift off some of the pigment. But it really is useful to do this, because it's almost like when you look at the ear, there are so many layers of fur in the ear. It's almost like, well, how can you replicate that on a flat surface? You have to build those layers as if they were real, as if it was real hair, and so the way that I've found that works best for me is to kind of replicate those layers of fur. You get your first layer down, you get your second layer down, you get, and using this sort of subtraction method, lifting out the highlights and everything rather than working around them, does work really, really well. Right. So then you can work together with your Scotch Magic tape and your pencil, then just to start building in some of the detail. So being a little bit more prescribed with your marks that you're putting down. Here I'm moving sort of quite lightly to a bit of an increased pressure, just to show the depth of that area of fur there. And then we've got all of these little shapes going on here, where I can start to build in areas that are going to look like individual hairs. But being careful to keep it really soft at the same time. So this is starting to have some really nice areas of layering going on here, where it is starting to look like the hairs lying over the top of each other. Just need to, oops, let's take out a little bit of colour on here. Okay, so just starting to add in a little bit more. So I'm using a little bit more pressure here in these darker areas. We're going over that caput mortuum, so we're getting quite a nice rich black. This is a walnut brown that actually I hadn't meant to start using because I'd used it for the embossing, but not the embossing, the drawing on the back of the Scotch Magic tape, but actually there are some sort of brown tinges going on that I'll then add a wash of or a glaze of like a brighter orange to. and the warm grey too, just to pull it together. So you can see it's starting to resemble a fluffy ear now, and it just takes a little bit of patience just to build those initial layers up, and then the confidence that you can take away the pigment and add it back in again, and actually that is going to help. So with the black, I'm using it as like just a wash of grey in places, and then just increasing the pressure very slightly if I want, you know, a nice sort of dark area of shadow. But these are tiny, tiny areas, and it's literally just a case of just taking your time and building it up. And we're looking at drawing, or trying to draw, sometimes you get a bit carried away, but trying to draw shapes, you know, rather than detail. So finding areas to kind of copy the shapes is a good idea. Sitting back as well, you know, if you work quite close to a piece, I mean, my nose is sometimes nearly touching the paper, but sitting back and really assessing what you're doing and how everything's working is vital. I mentioned this quite a lot. It's so easy to get carried away and start, you know, creating something and putting something in, and something that I often do is there'll be a mark that's gone down, just a random mark, and I'll start working around it for no good reason at all other than it's there, and I'll work around it, and you know, 9 times out of 10 the mark shouldn't even have been there. So, you know, really, really concentrating on your reference photo. Just trying to get all your angles and that type of thing spot on. And don't go too dark too soon, because it means that you can just build your shadows gradually with lots of lovely colours underneath. And it will also mean that you can lift out colours if you do feel that you've gone a bit awry.